In the remote mountains of Breathitt County, Kentucky, 19 young women vanished without explanation between 1883 and 1887. Reverend Silas Wharton, a charismatic preacher who had established an isolated religious settlement deep in the Appalachian wilderness, claimed these women had received divine calling to serve God in complete seclusion. When a half-starved girl stumbled into the town of Jackson in the summer of 1887, speaking of underground sanctuaries and forced marriages to the prophet, Circuit Judge Marcus Renfro launched an investigation that would expose crimes hidden behind religious authority for 4 years. How did a man of God transform a house of worship into a prison? What darkness flourished when faith became justification for horror? Subscribe to stand with us as we document the stories history tried to bury, and comment your city and local time so we know where these dark truths reach across the world. The Kentucky mountains in 1883 were a landscape where civilization existed only in scattered fragments, separated by wilderness so dense that a man could walk 20 feet from a trail and become hopelessly lost within minutes. The ridges and hollows of Breathitt County rose and fell in endless succession, each valley deeper and more isolated than the last, covered in forests of oak and chestnut and pine that grew so thick their canopies blocked sunlight even at midday. The forest floor remained in perpetual twilight, moss covering everything, the air thick with the smell of decay and living growth combined into an odor that was neither pleasant nor exactly unpleasant, but simply the scent of wilderness untouched by human hands. Families lived in isolation that city dwellers could not comprehend. A homestead might be the only human habitation for 5 miles in any direction, accessible only by trails that required intimate knowledge to follow and that disappeared entirely during winter snows or spring floods. Some families went months without seeing another human being from outside their immediate household, their entire universe consisting of a log cabin, a few acres of cleared land carved from the forest, and the surrounding wilderness that both sustained and threatened them in equal measure. There were no roads in the modern sense, no bridges strong enough to survive the spring floods that turned peaceful creeks into torrents capable of moving boulders the size of wagons. Telegraph lines had not penetrated this far into the mountains. The railroad stopped in Lexington, 60 miles away across terrain so rugged that the journey might take a week on horseback in good weather, or 2 weeks on foot through passes that were impassable during winter. News from the outside world arrived sporadically, carried by traveling merchants or by men who had ventured to market towns and returned with newspapers that were weeks or months out of date, their information already obsolete before it reached the remote hollers. The Civil War had devastated what little infrastructure had existed in eastern Kentucky. Union and Confederate forces had both moved through the region, requisitioning supplies, conscripting men, burning homesteads suspected of harboring the enemy. Families had taken sides not from political conviction, but from immediate necessity, aligning with whichever army happened to control their particular hollow at a particular moment. The war had ended in 1865, but by 1883, 20 years later, the mountains had still not recovered. Families survived through subsistence farming on steep hillsides that barely produced enough corn and tobacco to feed themselves, through hunting game that was growing scarcer as the forests were slowly cleared, through making moonshine that could be sold to merchants willing to ignore federal liquor laws that meant nothing in places where federal authority barely existed. Religion was the thread that held this isolated world together. Baptist and Methodist preachers traveled circuit routes that might cover 100 miles through the mountains, visiting each settlement once a month or once every 3 months depending on weather and trail conditions. They baptized babies, married couples, preached sermons that were the only formal education many mountain people ever received. Churches were simple log structures without heat or glass windows, furnished with rough benches and a pulpit that was often just a wooden box. Services lasted for hours with preaching that emphasized hellfire and damnation and the absolute authority of Scripture interpreted through traditions that had changed little since the first settlers had pushed into these mountains 50 years earlier. Into this world of isolation and religious fervor came Silas Wharton in the spring of 1882. He arrived in Jackson, the county seat, riding a mule, carrying a worn Bible and a satchel containing everything he owned. He was 41 years old, a tall man standing over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that suggested physical strength beneath the plain black coat he wore. His face was weathered from years of outdoor living. His beard streaked with gray, but his eyes were what people noticed first. They were dark and intense, eyes that seemed to look through you rather than at you, eyes that suggested either divine inspiration or something darker that mimicked holiness without being genuinely holy. Wharton claimed to be a circuit preacher from Virginia, though no one could verify this, and he provided no letters of introduction from established churches. He said he had received a vision while praying alone in the wilderness, a vision in which God had commanded him to establish a sanctuary deep in the Kentucky mountains where true believers could live according to divine law, uncorrupted by the wickedness of modern civilization. He spoke of coming tribulations, of how the industrial cities and their sinful ways would soon be destroyed in fire and judgment, of how only those who had returned to the purity of the Old Testament patriarchs would survive when God's wrath fell upon the earth. His preaching drew crowds immediately. The residents of Jackson and the surrounding hollers were accustomed to fire and brimstone theology, but Wharton's sermons had an intensity that set him apart from other preachers they had heard. He did not just warn vaguely about sin and damnation, but described in vivid detail the exact nature of the wickedness corrupting America and the precise requirements for salvation. He emphasized Old Testament passages about the patriarchs and their multiple wives, about Abraham and Sarah and Hagar, about Jacob and Rachel and Leah, about the divine command to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth with chosen people who would carry forward God's purposes. He suggested that salvation required not just individual faith, but the creation of a community where divine law governed every aspect of life, including marriage and childbearing and the raising of children according to principles that modern churches had abandoned. Within weeks of his arrival, Wharton had gathered a following of families drawn to his vision and willing to join him in establishing the sanctuary he claimed God had commanded him to create. In June of 1882, using money he said came from the sale of his property in Virginia, Wharton purchased 160 acres in a hollow so remote that even experienced hunters hesitated to venture there. The locals called it lost ground because surveying parties had gotten confused by the terrain, losing their bearings and emerging miles from where they had intended, and because the hollow had a reputation for disorienting visitors, making them lose their sense of direction even when the sun was clearly visible. The property sat at the end of a trail that required 4 hours of hard walking from the nearest settlement. It was accessible only during certain seasons, becoming impassable when winter snows filled the hollow or when spring floods turned the creek running through it into a torrent that washed away any attempt at bridging. The hollow was shaped like a bowl, surrounded by steep ridges that blocked wind and created a pocket of still air that made the place feel separated from the world beyond, as though it existed in a different realm where normal rules did not apply. Dense forest covered every slope, and limestone outcroppings visible on several hillsides suggested caves that riddled the hills throughout that region. Wharton and his initial followers, perhaps a dozen families, began clearing land and constructing buildings in July of 1882. The meeting house came first, a structure built from logs cut on the property. Measuring 40 feet by 20 feet with a dirt floor and rough-hewn benches arranged in rows facing a pulpit fashioned from a single massive oak log that had taken 6 men to move into position. The building had no windows, only shutters that could be opened for light and closed against weather, and a stone chimney at one end that would provide heat during cold months. Around the meeting house, families built cabins for their individual households, each family maintaining its own living space while sharing community work on cleared fields where they would plant corn and beans and tobacco. To outside observers, the settlement appeared to be a typical, isolated religious community. Eccentric perhaps in its strict interpretation of Scripture, but not fundamentally different from other groups that had retreated into the mountains seeking to live according to their own understanding of God's commands. But from the very beginning, Wharton had been planning something far beyond a simple religious settlement. During the first months after purchasing the property, before other families had arrived to join him, he had explored the limestone caves that opened in the hillside behind where the meeting house would be built. He had discovered an extensive cave system, passages that extended deep into the mountain, chambers both natural and carved by water over millennia, spaces that could be enlarged and modified to serve purposes he did not share with his initial followers. Through the summer and fall of 1882, while publicly working on the meeting house and cleared fields, Wharton spent his nights in those caves. He worked by lamplight, expanding passages with pick and shovel, carving connecting tunnels between separate chambers, creating isolated cells where women could be confined with no possibility of communication with each other or with the world above. He installed wooden doors with iron hinges he had purchased in Jackson, claiming they were for storage buildings. He bought chains and iron rings, explaining they were needed for securing livestock against bears and mountain lions. He created a hidden entrance behind the meeting house, disguised by a shed that appeared to be simple storage but that actually covered stairs descending into the cave system he was transforming into a prison. By the time the first families arrived to join his sanctuary, Wharton had prepared the underground complex where he would eventually confine 19 women over the following 4 years. And he was ready to begin recruiting the first victims for what he would later describe in his journals as his divine breeding program, his attempt to create a race of chosen people who would carry forward God's plan through bloodlines purified by isolation and controlled by his absolute authority as prophet and spiritual father to a new generation born in darkness and raised according to his twisted interpretation of Scripture. The first young woman to join Wharton's sanctuary as what he called a spiritual wife was Sarah Mullins, 16 years old, daughter of a farmer named Ezekiel Mullins, whose family had homesteaded in a hollow 5 miles east of Lost Ground. Sarah had been born in 1866, the middle daughter of 7 children, a quiet girl who had shown from an early age a religious devotion that her parents encouraged as proper for a young woman. She attended Wharton's first public services at the sanctuary in July of 1882, traveling with her family on foot through the trails that connected the scattered homesteads of that region. She was moved by his preaching in ways that concerned her mother, but that her father interpreted as genuine spiritual calling. Wharton spoke directly to Sarah after one service, telling her that he had observed her devotion during worship, that God had revealed to him in prayer that she possessed special spiritual gifts, that she was destined for higher service than the ordinary life of a mountain wife raising children in poverty. Over the following weeks, Wharton visited the Mullins homestead several times, ostensibly to counsel the family on spiritual matters, but actually to cultivate Sarah's interest in joining the sanctuary permanently as one of his spiritual wives. He spoke of the honor this would bring to her family, of the divine purpose she would fulfill by helping to create the community of the faithful that would survive the coming tribulations. He quoted scripture about women who had served the patriarchs, about the blessedness of bearing children to men chosen by God, about the rewards in heaven for those who sacrifice worldly pleasures to fulfill divine commands. Sarah's father, Ezekiel Mullins, was a devout Baptist who believed firmly in clerical authority and who interpreted Wharton's interest in his daughter as a sign of God's favor on his family. When Sarah asked permission to join the sanctuary as a spiritual wife in September of 1882, her father gave his blessing despite her mother's misgivings about sending their daughter to live under the authority of a man they barely knew. Sarah packed a small bag containing a change of clothes, her Bible, and a quilt her grandmother had made. She said goodbye to her family and walked with Wharton to the sanctuary where she would never again live as a free woman. For 3 months after Sarah joined the sanctuary, her family received regular messages delivered by members of the community who traveled to nearby settlements to trade or purchase supplies. The messages were brief, written in Sarah's handwriting on scraps of paper, confirming that she was well, that she was studying scripture and learning the ways of the community, that she was happy in her service to God, and grateful for the opportunity her father had provided by giving his consent to her joining. Then in December of 1882, the messages stopped. When Ezekiel Mullins traveled to the sanctuary in early January of 1883 to inquire about his daughter, Wharton met him at the door of the meeting house and explained that Sarah had entered a period of sacred seclusion. She was being prepared for her spiritual marriage to the prophet, a process that required complete isolation from worldly contacts, including family members. This preparation might take months or even years, as God's timing could not be rushed by human impatience. Sarah was being tested in her devotion, purified through prayer and meditation and fasting, transformed into a vessel suitable for the holy purpose God had assigned to her as one of the mothers of the chosen race that would survive the tribulations. Wharton's explanation was delivered with such calm authority and with such detailed reference to biblical precedents that Ezekiel Mullins found himself unable to challenge it, despite the discomfort he felt at being separated from his daughter with no clear timeline for when contact might resume. The preacher promised that when Sarah's preparation was complete, she would emerge transformed by her communion with the divine and would bring honor to her family through the children she would bear to God's chosen prophet. To demand to see her now, Wharton suggested gently but firmly, would be to interfere with God's work and might compromise Sarah's spiritual development in ways that would jeopardize her eternal soul and bring divine judgment upon the entire Mullins family for their lack of faith. Ezekiel Mullins returned to his homestead without seeing his daughter, troubled but ultimately accepting the preacher's authority on religious matters that he himself did not fully understand. His wife wept and expressed fear that something was wrong, that no good could come from a father not being allowed to see his own daughter. But Ezekiel silenced her with the assertion that questioning a man of God was a sin that would bring judgment on their entire family, that they must trust that Wharton was acting according to divine guidance, even if his methods seemed strange to ordinary believers who lacked his special connection to God's will. What Ezekiel Mullins did not know, what he would not learn until the raid 4 years later, was that his daughter Sarah had been taken into the underground chambers beneath the sanctuary within days of the last message he had received from her. She had been confined in a cell carved into limestone, chained by one ankle to an iron ring driven into the rock wall, given minimal food and water, kept in darkness, broken only by the oil lamp Wharton carried when he visited her to explain her divine purpose, and to begin the systematic process of breaking her will until she accepted his authority over every aspect of her existence. The pattern continued with ruthless consistency over the following 4 years. In March of 1883, Martha Bingham joined the sanctuary, a 17-year-old daughter of a widowed mother who struggled to feed 5 children on a hardscrabble farm. Martha lasted only 3 weeks, sending messages before disappearing into Wharton's underground chambers. In August of 1883, 2 sisters named Rebecca and Hannah Sizemore, ages 15 and 17, joined together from a family in the southern part of the county. In November, a girl named Catherine Perry, 14 years old, followed her older cousin into Wharton's community, believing she was entering a life of holy service rather than captivity. Through 1884, 5 more young women joined. Elizabeth Porter in February, a studious girl who could read and who had hoped to become a teacher before Wharton convinced her that educating the children of the chosen race was a higher calling. Nancy Baker in April, whose family was so desperately poor that her parents saw her joining the sanctuary as providential, one less mouth to feed, and perhaps a pathway to divine favor that might ease their hardship. Twins named Louisa and Lucy Combs in June. Identical sisters who had never been separated and who joined together after Wharton convinced them that their twinship was a sign of special divine favor. Margaret Hall in October, the oldest daughter of a family that had lost 3 sons to fever, and who saw Margaret's religious calling as God's consolation for their losses. Each recruitment followed the same script that Wharton had perfected with Sarah Mullins. He would identify a young woman from a family that attended his increasingly popular public services. He would single her out for spiritual attention, praising her devotion during worship, suggesting she possessed special gifts that set her apart from ordinary believers, hinting that God had revealed her name to him as one chosen for higher purpose. He would visit the family's homestead, would quote scripture about the patriarchs and their wives, would describe the honor and distinction of serving as a spiritual wife to a prophet, would obtain parental permission for the girl to join the sanctuary. The girl would arrive, would send brief messages for a few weeks or months confirming her well-being, then would vanish into the underground chambers from which no message could be sent and no escape was possible without outside intervention. By the end of 1884, 11 young women had disappeared into Wharton's operation. Their families, scattered across Breathitt County in homesteads that were sometimes days apart by difficult trails, had no way to communicate with each other about the pattern emerging. No reason to suspect that their daughters' similar experiences of joining the sanctuary and then entering sacred seclusion represented anything more than individual cases of deep religious devotion that happened to follow similar paths because they were all under the guidance of the same spiritual leader. The recruiting continued through 1885 and 1886. Mary Fletcher joined in January of 1885, a shy girl who had never been more than 10 miles from her family's cabin and who saw the sanctuary as an adventure as well as a religious calling. Susan Wright in April, whose father was a moonshiner who believed that sending his daughter to serve a preacher might balance the scales of divine judgment when his inevitable trial for violating liquor laws came to pass. Jane Addams in August, an orphan who had been living with relatives who saw her religious calling as a convenient solution to the problem of what to do with an extra child in an already overcrowded household. Rachel Compton in October, 15 years old, a strong-willed girl whose resistance to Wharton's authority would eventually lead to her escape and testimony that would expose his crimes. Through 1886, Wharton recruited Ann Cooper in February, the daughter of a family that had recently moved to Breathitt County from Tennessee, and that had not yet established strong connections in the community. Polly Johnson in May, a girl whose mother had died in childbirth the previous year, and whose father was struggling to care for 5 children alone, and 2 more women in the autumn, whose names would not survive in any records, women who either came from such isolated circumstances that their disappearances went entirely unreported or whose families were so ashamed of having sent daughters into a situation that turned out to be captivity that they later refused to acknowledge their connection to Wharton's sanctuary. By the spring of 1887, 19 women were confined in the underground chambers beneath Wharton's settlement, living in conditions that no one above ground suspected existed. The cells where they were confined measured perhaps 8 feet by 8 feet, carved into the limestone, with just enough height for a woman to stand upright in the center where the ceiling was highest. Each cell contained a crude sleeping pallet made from straw covered with rough cloth, a bucket for waste, and an iron ring driven into the wall where a chain could be attached to secure a prisoner's ankle and prevent any possibility of escape, even if she somehow managed to open the locked door. There were no windows, no ventilation except what filtered through passages from the entrance far away, no light except what oil lamps provided when Wharton or his accomplices visited. The air was cool and damp year-round, the temperature remaining constant regardless of the season above ground. This consistency prevented exposure during winter, but created health problems, particularly respiratory illnesses that were common in the underground environment where the air never quite circulated properly and where dampness never fully dried from the stone walls. The smell was overwhelming. Human waste accumulated despite the buckets. The dampness created mold and mildew. Unwashed bodies contributed their own odors after months or years without proper bathing facilities. The smoke from oil lamps left a residue that coated everything and that created a distinctive smell of burned oil mixed with limestone dust. And beneath all these identifiable odors was something else, something that defied precise description, but that the women who lived there understood as the smell of fear and despair and hopelessness, a psychological odor that seemed to permeate every surface of the chambers where they were imprisoned. Wharton visited the underground chambers daily, descending the stairs with an oil lamp and the absolute confidence of a man who believed genuinely in his divine right to control the women he had imprisoned. He brought food, basic provisions that kept the women alive but that were deliberately insufficient to maintain their health or full strength. A woman weakened by hunger was less likely to attempt resistance or escape. He conducted what he called inspections, checking on pregnant women's progress, examining newborn infants with the critical eye of a breeder assessing livestock, determining which women would participate in the breeding rituals he scheduled according to his interpretation of biblical numerology and his own evolving theories about optimal conditions for producing superior offspring. He also brought scripture, reading passages about the patriarchs and their multiple wives, about Sarah and Hagar competing to bear children to Abraham, about Rachel and Leah and their handmaids all bearing children to Jacob in a complex web of rivalry and divine favor. He interpreted these passages as direct authorization for his breeding program, as evidence that God had established precedents in the earliest days of his covenant with his chosen people that Wharton was now following in creating his own chosen race that would survive the coming tribulations and repopulate the earth with pure believers untainted by the corruptions of modern civilization. Wharton had also recruited accomplices from among the women he held captive, prisoners who had submitted so completely to his authority that he trusted them to help maintain his system. A woman named Judith, who had joined the sanctuary in 1884 and who had borne 3 children to Wharton in captivity, served as his primary assistant. She had been granted limited freedom to move between chambers, delivering food to other prisoners, assisting with births, helping to care for the children who were kept in a separate nursery chamber after being taken from their mothers immediately following delivery. Judith's cooperation was purchased partly through better treatment, marginally more food, and slightly less harsh conditions than the women confined in isolation cells, but also through psychological manipulation that Wharton had perfected through years of practice. He had convinced Judith that she was special, that her submission demonstrated superior spiritual understanding, that she was being prepared for a leadership role in the chosen community that would emerge after the tribulations. He had also made clear that any betrayal or attempt to help other women escape would result in her children being killed, a threat that kept Judith compliant even when her conscience troubled her about her role in maintaining other women's captivity. 2 other women served similar roles, helping Wharton maintain his underground prison in exchange for marginally better treatment and for being allowed to see their children more frequently than the women confined in isolation cells. This system of using some prisoners to control others was perhaps Wharton's most effective tool for preventing organized resistance. The women did not trust each other, could not be certain that someone they confided in would not report their words to Wharton in exchange for favor or better treatment. And this mutual suspicion prevented the kind of collective action that might have led to a mass escape attempt or to someone finding a way to send word to the outside world about what was happening beneath the sanctuary. But one woman refused to submit completely to Wharton's authority despite 2 years of captivity and despite having borne 2 children in the underground chambers. Rachel Compton, who had joined the sanctuary in October of 1885 at age 15, maintained throughout her imprisonment a determination to escape and expose Wharton's crimes. She cooperated enough to avoid the worst punishments, participated in Wharton's rituals when resistance would have been futile, but she never stopped watching for opportunities and never stopped planning for the moment when she might find a way to flee. That moment came in June of 1887. Rachel had recently given birth to her second child, a daughter who had been taken from her within hours of delivery, just as her son born the previous year had been taken. She was weak from childbirth and from the infection that had developed afterward, but she was also desperate with grief at having another child torn away before she could even properly hold the infant. On the afternoon of June 17th, Judith had been careless while delivering food to Rachel's cell, distracted by trying to manage a tray while also carrying a lamp. She had set the lamp down to unlock Rachel's door, had handed the food through the partially open door, then had turned away to pick up the lamp without properly securing the lock. Rachel had noticed this immediately. The bolt had not fully seated in its bracket, and when Judith walked away, the door remained technically locked but not secured in a way that would withstand pressure. Rachel waited until she heard Judith's footsteps fade up the passage, then she pushed carefully on the door. The bolt shifted, the door opened, and Rachel found herself standing in the passage for the first time in 2 years outside of the brief moments when she had been escorted to the birthing chamber or to Wharton's larger ritual space. She did not hesitate. She ran toward what she hoped was the direction of the stairs, moving in complete darkness because she had no lamp, feeling her way along the damp stone walls, stumbling over uneven floor, driven by terror that at any moment she would hear pursuit or that she would run directly into Wharton or one of his accomplices. She found the stairs by falling into them, her hands hitting the bottom step, and she climbed upward on hands and knees because she was too weak to stand and too frightened to slow down even slightly. At the top of the stairs was the wooden door that separated the underground chambers from the shed above. Rachel pushed on this door expecting it to be locked, but incredibly it opened. Wharton had been in the chambers earlier that day and had apparently failed to properly secure this entrance when he returned to the surface. Rachel emerged into the shed, blinking in the daylight that filtered through cracks in the walls, seeing for the first time in 2 years something other than lamplight and stone walls. She did not pause to orient herself or to consider what direction she should flee. She simply ran, pushing through the shed door into the forest behind the sanctuary, running downhill because that was the direction gravity pulled her weakened body, crashing through underbrush without any thought for stealth or direction, knowing only that she had to get as far away as possible before Wharton discovered her escape and sent men to recapture her. She ran until her legs gave out, perhaps a quarter mile from the sanctuary. Then she crawled, dragging herself through the forest, following the downward slope because streams flowed downhill and streams eventually led to settlement. She moved through that afternoon and into the night, stopping only when exhaustion made further movement impossible, then forcing herself to continue after a few hours of fitful rest that was more like unconsciousness than actual sleep. She had no food, no water, except what she could lap from streams like an animal, no shoes because prisoners in the underground chambers were kept barefoot to make escape more difficult. For 3 days and nights, Rachel crawled and stumbled through the Kentucky wilderness, driven forward by the desperate need to reach civilization before she died from exposure or infection, or simply from the accumulated trauma of 2 years of captivity followed by an escape that was destroying what little remained of her physical health. She was delirious with fever by the second day, hallucinating conversations with her mother and her sisters, seeing visions of her children, losing track of whether she was moving forward or in circles. On the morning of June 19th, 1887, farmer Josiah Combs was checking his tobacco field in bottomland near Jackson when he heard sounds coming from the woods bordering his property. He investigated and found a young woman collapsed beneath a sycamore tree, her feet raw and bleeding where the skin had torn away completely, her dress torn and filthy, her body showing signs of severe malnutrition and recent childbirth. She was conscious, but barely, speaking in fragments about underground chambers and the prophet and babies taken away and women chained in darkness. Combs carried the woman to his cabin and sent his son running to Jackson to fetch both a doctor and the law. By early afternoon, Circuit Judge Marcus Renfro arrived accompanied by Dr. William Hackworth, the only trained physician within 20 miles. Dr. Hackworth examined the woman carefully, documenting injuries and conditions that told a story of extended captivity and systematic abuse. There were scars on her wrists and ankles consistent with prolonged restraint by chains or rope. There was evidence of multiple pregnancies in rapid succession, her body showing the strain of bearing children without adequate recovery time between births. There was severe malnutrition that had caused her hair to thin and her teeth to loosen. There was the recent childbirth that had left her body weakened and fighting infection that might kill her despite treatment. As Dr. Hackworth addressed the immediate medical concerns, Rachel regained enough lucidity to identify herself. She was Rachel Compton, 17 years old. From a family in the eastern part of the county, she had joined Wharton Sanctuary in October of 1885 at age 15, believing she was entering a life of holy service. She described being taken into underground chambers shortly after her arrival, being confined in a limestone cell, being subjected to what Wharton called breeding rituals. She described other women held in similar conditions, perhaps 15 or more, that she had encountered during her 2 years below ground. She described children born in darkness, taken from their mothers, raised communally by women who had submitted to Wharton's authority. Over the following 3 days, as Rachel's strength fluctuated and as infection threatened her life despite Dr. Hackworth's best efforts, she provided Judge Renfro with testimony that was both devastatingly specific and broadly damning. She described the layout of the underground complex as she remembered it, drawing crude maps that showed the main passage and the branching chambers. She named specific women she had known in captivity, women whose families had filed inquiries with authorities over the years, but who had been presumed to be in voluntary religious seclusion. She detailed Wharton's routines, his nightly visits to different women according to schedules he maintained in journals, his theological justifications delivered in long sermons about the patriarchs and chosen bloodlines. She described the births of the children who were born underground, the primitive medical conditions, the high mortality rate among infants who could not survive in the damp darkness. She testified about her own 2 children, a son born in 1886 and a daughter born just 3 weeks earlier, both taken from her immediately after delivery, both being raised in a nursery chamber where she was occasionally allowed to see them but never to hold them or care for them in any meaningful way. Judge Renfro questioned Rachel meticulously, documenting every detail with the precision of someone who understood that testimony from a traumatized survivor would be challenged by defense attorneys if the case ever reached trial. He asked her to provide specific physical descriptions of the chambers that could be verified during an investigation. He asked her to recall distinctive features of the women she had known, details that could be compared to descriptions provided by their families. He asked about Wharton's accomplices, the women who helped him maintain the underground prison, and Rachel named Judith as the primary assistant, along with 2 other women whose names she did not know, but whose faces and circumstances she could describe in detail. As Renfro compiled this testimony during those 3 days while Rachel fought infection that might kill her before she could see justice done, he understood that he finally had both the evidence needed to act and the moral obligation that transcended all concerns about political consequences or religious freedom. Women were being held in captivity beneath a religious settlement, imprisoned under conditions that violated every principle of law and human decency. Children were being born and raised in darkness, deprived of sunlight and normal human development. A preacher was conducting what he called divine service, but what was actually systematic crime justified through theological delusion that had flourished unchecked for 4 years. On June 23, 1887, Judge Renfro presented Rachel's testimony to Sheriff Thomas Garrard in a meeting that included only the 2 men and Dr. Hackworth as medical witness. The testimony was read in full, Rachel's physical condition described as evidence of its accuracy. Renfro announced his intention to authorize a raid on Wharton's sanctuary that same day, before the preacher could learn of Rachel's escape and destroy evidence, or harm the women being held captive, or flee into the wilderness where he might never be found. Sheriff Garrard immediately recognized the political danger of raiding a religious community based on one woman's testimony, but he also recognized that Renfro had the legal authority to order such action, and that refusing to execute the judge's warrant would constitute dereliction of duty that would end his career and possibly result in criminal charges. By midday, Garrard had assembled a force of 8 deputies willing to undertake what might become a violent confrontation with people convinced they were defending God's work against agents of Satan sent to destroy their prophet and their community. The raid commenced at 2 o'clock that afternoon. Garrard's deputies accompanied Judge Renfro, who carried the legal authority that would counter any claims of unlawful intrusion into religious territory. They rode openly to Wharton's sanctuary, making no attempt at stealth, announcing through their numbers and their weapons that this was official action authorized by Kentucky law that would not be turned away by religious claims of autonomy or by threats of divine retribution against those who interfered with the prophet's sacred mission. Silas Wharton met them at the meeting house door, his expression showing surprise but also a serene confidence, as though he believed his divine protection would shield him from earthly authority just as it had shielded him for 4 years while he built his underground prison and populated it with women stolen from their families through manipulation masquerading as religious calling. He demanded to know the meaning of this armed invasion, this persecution of God's chosen community that he would report to every religious authority in Kentucky and to newspapers that would expose this violation of constitutional protections for religious freedom. Judge Renfro's response was simple and devastating. He read from Rachel Compton's testimony, the opening paragraphs describing the underground chambers, naming specific women Wharton held captive, detailing the layout and routines and conditions that only someone who had actually been confined below could possibly know with such precision. As Wharton listened, his expression changed from righteous indignation to recognition to something approaching panic as he understood that his system had been breached, that the woman he had probably assumed died in the wilderness had survived specifically to testify against him, that his carefully constructed theological justifications would not protect him from the law that was now demanding access to his property with force that would be used if he attempted to resist. Wharton attempted several responses as Renfro finished reading the testimony. He claimed this was a confused woman's delusion, trauma-induced fantasy created by someone who had suffered some kind of breakdown. If chambers existed beneath the sanctuary, they were merely storage spaces for supplies. Nothing more than enlarged natural caves that were unsuitable for habitation, and certainly not being used to confine anyone against their will. He claimed divine authority that superseded earthly law, insisted that his religious practices were protected by constitutional guarantees that judges and sheriffs had no jurisdiction to question or investigate regardless of what accusations were being made by unstable individuals. But these explanations dissolved in the face of Rachel's specific documented testimony that described details no outsider could know, naming women whose families had reported them missing into Wharton's care, providing physical descriptions of chambers and routines that could be verified through investigation. Judge Renfro demanded immediate access to all areas of the property, including the underground chambers Rachel had described in such detail. When Wharton refused, claiming religious law forbade unauthorized entry to sacred spaces where spiritual preparations were being conducted, Sheriff Garrard's deputies simply arrested him on charges of false imprisonment and conspiracy, placed him in iron manacles, and began their search of the property. The deputies found the entrance to the underground complex exactly where Rachel had described it, behind the meeting house, concealed beneath a wooden shed that appeared from outside to be simple storage, but that actually covered stairs descending into limestone caves that had been enlarged and modified into a prison system designed to hold multiple women in separate cells where they could be controlled individually and prevented from developing the collective resistance that might have threatened Wharton's authority. When the deputies forced the shed door open and descended the stairs with torches and oil lamps, they found themselves in a passage carved through solid rock, the walls showing both natural limestone formation and the marks of tools where Wharton had enlarged spaces or broken through barriers to connect separate chambers. The passage extended deep into the hillside, perhaps 80 feet from the entrance to the farthest chambers, with multiple doors branching off on both sides, each door secured from the outside with an iron bolt that could be lifted only by someone in the passage and never by whoever was confined behind the door. The first chamber the deputies entered was a cell measuring approximately 8 feet square, containing a crude sleeping pallet, a waste bucket, and a woman who reacted to the torchlight with terror, shrinking against the far wall and making sounds that were partly screams and partly wordless expressions of fear from someone who had learned through bitter experience that men entering her cell meant abuse or punishment or both. Deputy James Harlan, who entered first carrying a torch, stopped immediately and called for Judge Renfro, recognizing that this was evidence of crime beyond anything he had encountered in 15 years of law enforcement in Breathitt County. Judge Renfro entered the cell slowly, speaking in the gentle voice of someone trying not to frighten a wounded animal, identifying himself as a judge and as someone who had come to help rather than to harm. The woman gradually responded, emerging from her defensive posture enough to speak. Her name was Mary Fletcher. She had joined Wharton Sanctuary in January of 1885, more than 2 years earlier. She had been in this cell, chained by her ankle to the iron ring embedded in the wall, for most of that time except for brief periods when Wharton had moved her to other chambers for his breeding rituals, or when she had been taken to the birthing chamber to deliver the 2 children she had borne during her captivity. As deputies explored the underground complex, systematically documenting each chamber before moving to the next, the scope of Wharton's operation became clear. The cell where Mary Fletcher was confined was only one of multiple isolation chambers. Beyond it were other cells housing additional women, each confined alone, each responding to the deputies' arrival with fear rather than relief, because they had been told repeatedly that any attempt to escape or to communicate with the outside world would result in divine punishment and in harm to their children. There were chambers designated for different purposes within Wharton's system. A larger room that he used for what he called breeding rituals, furnished with multiple pallets where women were brought from their individual cells according to schedules he maintained. A chamber for pregnant women that was marginally more comfortable than the isolation cells, with better ventilation and slightly more food, because Wharton believed that better conditions during pregnancy would produce healthier offspring for his chosen race. A primitive medical chamber where births occurred, equipped with clean cloth and basic supplies, and a table where women in labor could lie while Judith or one of the other accomplices assisted with delivery. And most disturbingly, a nursery chamber where children born underground were kept after being taken from their mothers immediately following birth. This chamber was larger than the isolation cells, perhaps 15 feet by 15 feet, furnished with pallets and blankets and crude toys carved from wood. It housed 9 children when the deputies found it, ranging in age from infants perhaps 3 months old to a boy who appeared to be about 3 years old. The children showed evidence of their deprived upbringing that was obvious even to untrained observers. They were smaller than healthy children of similar ages, their growth stunted by malnutrition despite Wharton's attempts to provide adequate food. Their skin was pale to the point of appearing translucent, showing veins beneath the surface in ways that suggested they had never seen sunlight. Their eyes struggled with the torchlight that the deputies carried, designed as those eyes were for existence in permanent darkness, illuminated only by occasional oil lamps. Many of the children showed signs of illness common in the underground environment. Respiratory problems were evident in the wheezing and coughing that several children exhibited. Developmental delays were obvious in children who could not speak despite being old enough that normal children would have extensive vocabularies, who could not walk steadily despite being past the age when walking should be automatic, who showed the kind of problems that physicians would later attribute to profound deprivation during critical developmental periods when children's brains and bodies were establishing patterns that would persist throughout their lives. The woman caring for the children in the nursery chamber was Judith, the primary accomplice whom Rachel had named in her testimony. Judith did not resist when deputies entered, did not attempt to flee or to harm the children in her care. She simply stood amid the children she had been supervising, looking at the armed men with an expression that combined resignation with something that might have been relief, as though part of her had been waiting for this moment when the outside world would finally intrude into Wharton's underground kingdom and end the system she had helped maintain for 3 years despite whatever doubts troubled her conscience. The deputies counted 17 women in the underground chambers when all rooms were searched and documented. Their ages ranged from 16 to 23, though several looked older because malnutrition and harsh conditions had aged them prematurely. All of them had joined Wharton's sanctuary voluntarily, believing they were entering religious service, only to be taken into the underground system shortly after arrival. The length of their captivity varied from 6 months for the most recently arrived to 4 years for Sarah Mullins, who had been the first woman Wharton had imprisoned and who had endured conditions underground longer than any of the others. But these 17 women did not account for all 19 families who had reported sending daughters to Wharton's sanctuary over the previous 4 years. This discrepancy demanded explanation, and that explanation came from the most disturbing discovery of the entire raid. At the deepest extent of the underground complex beyond the living areas and the nursery, deputies found a passage that had been sealed with a crude wall built from loose stones mortared together with mud. When this wall was broken through, deputies discovered a burial chamber where Wharton had disposed of women and children who had died during his operation. The bodies were not carefully buried as Christian tradition demanded, but simply laid in the cave, wrapped in rough cloth, stacked in rows where the cool, dry conditions of the limestone chamber had partially preserved them, but where decomposition was still evident, and where the smell was overwhelming even to men accustomed to death in its various forms. Deputy Samuel Croft, assigned to document the burial chamber, counted carefully, despite the horror of the task. 7 bodies were recorded. 5 were clearly young women, their sizes and the remnants of clothing identifying them as adolescent or young adult females. 2 were infants, their tiny wrapped forms lying separate from the larger bodies. Causes of death could not be determined with certainty from examination of decomposed remains using the limited forensic capabilities available in 1880s Kentucky. But physical evidence suggested multiple causes. Some bodies showed no signs of trauma and had likely died from illness, perhaps the respiratory infections that were common in the underground environment, or perhaps from complications related to pregnancy and childbirth. One body showed what appeared to be a skull fracture, suggesting death from violence, possibly punishment that had gone too far, or possibly an intentional killing. The infant body suggested death shortly after birth, a tragically common outcome in the primitive medical conditions of the underground chambers, where proper sanitation and medical care were impossible to maintain. These 7 bodies combined with the 17 living women accounted for 24 individuals. The discrepancy between this number and the 19 families who had filed inquiries suggested that Wharton had recruited additional women whose families had not reported them missing, possibly girls from such isolated circumstances that their absence went entirely unnoticed in a region where young women sometimes disappeared into marriage or migration without formal record keeping, or possibly women whose families were too ashamed after learning the truth to acknowledge publicly that they had sent daughters into a situation that had resulted in captivity and abuse. The final damning evidence came from Wharton's own documentation, discovered in a chamber that served as his private study within the underground complex here, lit by multiple oil lamps that made the space brighter than any of the chambers where women were confined. The preacher had maintained detailed records of his breeding program. Multiple journals bound in leather documented every aspect of his operation. One journal recorded the names of every woman brought into the chambers, with dates of their arrival, family backgrounds, physical descriptions, and assessments of their suitability for his breeding program based on criteria that mixed physical attributes with his interpretation of their spiritual qualities. Another journal recorded pregnancies and births with the precision of someone maintaining livestock breeding records. He noted conception dates when he could estimate them, pregnancy durations, delivery circumstances, infant characteristics at birth. He recorded which women had borne children successfully and which had experienced miscarriages or stillbirths. He noted infant survival rates, tracking which children had died in their first weeks or months, and attempting to identify patterns that might help him improve outcomes in future breeding cycles. Most disturbing were journals where Wharton explained his theological justification for everything he was doing. These writings revealed a mind that had constructed an elaborate, delusional system, mixing genuine biblical passages with interpretations that had no basis in any established Christian tradition. He wrote that God had appeared to him in visions, commanding him specifically to create a new race of humans who would be superior to ordinary people, who would combine the divine favor of being born from women consecrated to God's service with the best qualities of fathers carefully selected for their intelligence and physical perfection. He wrote that this breeding program was sacred duty assigned to him alone as prophet, that he could not share it with other religious authorities because they would not understand the divine command he had received and would interfere with God's plan through their blind adherence to human traditions that had corrupted true Christianity. He described the underground chambers not as prisons but as sanctuaries where women were being protected from the corruptions of the outside world while being prepared for their divine purpose. He described his nightly visits and the breeding rituals not as rape but as sacred acts fulfilling biblical patterns established by the patriarchs, with no apparent recognition that what he was doing constituted systematic abuse of women who had been placed in his spiritual care. The journals showed complete absence of remorse or doubt, only frustration when pregnancies failed to produce the results he wanted, or when children died, or when women resisted his authority in ways that required punishment to restore the proper order. Judge Renfro read through these journals by lamplight in the underground study where Wharton had recorded his delusions, understanding that he was witnessing the documentary evidence of how religious authority combined with complete lack of oversight and with genuine mental illness could produce systematic crime that persisted for years. The journals would serve as evidence in the trial that would follow, but they also served as a kind of confession. Wharton's own testimony about exactly what he had done, and why he believed every violation was justified by divine command that superseded all earthly law and human morality. By nightfall of June 23rd, the raid was complete. The 17 women and 9 children had been brought up from the underground chambers, blinking in the fading daylight, many of them seeing the sun for the first time in months or years, or for the first time in their lives in the case of the children born underground. They were in various states of physical and mental distress. Some were able to walk with assistance. Others had to be carried because their legs had atrophied from confinement in cells too small to allow proper movement. All were malnourished. Most showed signs of illness that would require medical treatment. The psychological trauma was evident in their responses to kindness, their inability to believe they were actually being rescued, their fear that this was some kind of trick and that they would soon be returned to the chambers and punished for whatever role they might have played in bringing outside authority into Wharton's sanctuary. Silas Wharton had been placed in custody along with Judith and 2 other women who had served as accomplices. The sanctuary's remaining members, those who had attended Sunday services but who apparently had not known about the underground chambers, were questioned extensively to determine whether they had participated in or facilitated Wharton's crimes, or whether they had been as deceived as the families who had sent daughters into his care. Most appeared genuinely shocked by what had been discovered beneath the meeting house where they had worshipped, unable to reconcile the prophet they had followed with the criminal who had built a prison beneath their feet. Judge Renfro began the massive task of documenting everything discovered, creating records that would serve as evidence for trial and that would provide historical account of what had happened beneath Wharton's sanctuary over 4 years. He arranged for the women to be housed temporarily in Jackson, where Dr. Hackworth could provide medical care, and where they could be protected from curiosity seekers and from any remaining followers of Wharton who might attempt to intimidate them into silence. He sent word to families throughout Breathitt County that their daughters had been found and rescued, though in many cases, the women who were recovered bore little resemblance to the healthy adolescents who had joined the sanctuary years earlier, transformed by captivity into damaged survivors who would struggle for the rest of their lives to recover from trauma that had fundamentally altered their psychological and physical development. The trial of Silas Wharton began in September of 1887 in the county courthouse in Jackson. The proceedings drew spectators from across Kentucky and reporters from Louisville and Lexington newspapers who recognized that this case represented more than ordinary frontier crime. Here was a religious leader, someone who had been trusted with spiritual authority over vulnerable believers, who had systematically betrayed that trust to create what amounted to a private prison where he could abuse women under the justification of divine command. The trial would test how Kentucky law dealt with crimes committed under the shield of religious freedom, and how courts balanced constitutional protections for religion against the state's duty to protect citizens from abuse regardless of whether that abuse was sanctified by theological claims. Wharton offered no conventional defense. He stood before the court and calmly explained his breeding program exactly as he had documented it in the journals seized during the raid. He described receiving visions commanding him to create a superior race through controlled breeding of consecrated women with men selected for their qualities. He detailed the conditions he had maintained in the underground chambers, the provision of food and shelter and medical care, that he believed demonstrated his concern for the women's welfare, even as he acknowledged keeping them confined against their will. He explained the spiritual marriages and breeding rituals as fulfillment of biblical patterns established by the patriarchs, as sacred duty assigned to him by God through direct revelation. He showed no remorse because he genuinely believed he had fulfilled divine commands rather than committing crimes. In his understanding, shaped by years of isolation and reinforced by the absolute authority he had exercised over the women in his chambers, he had devoted 4 years to a sacred project that would benefit humanity, even if the current generation could not understand its importance. The women had been honored to participate in divine work. Their suffering, to the extent that he acknowledged it occurred, was necessary sacrifice for a greater purpose that would be vindicated when God's tribulations destroyed the corrupt world and only his chosen race survived to repopulate the earth. The jury deliberated for 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on 19 counts of kidnapping, 17 counts of false imprisonment, 7 counts of murder in the deaths of the women and children whose bodies had been found in the burial chamber, and multiple counts of assault related to the abuse the survivors had endured during captivity. Under Kentucky law in 1887, Wharton faced death by hanging for these crimes. The 3 female accomplices, including Judith, received prison sentences ranging from 10 to 20 years, depending on their level of involvement, and on assessments of whether they had been coerced into cooperation or had acted willingly. The sentence was carried out on November 3, 1887, less than 5 months after Rachel Compton's escape had exposed Wharton's crimes. Silas Wharton was hanged in the public square in Jackson before a crowd estimated at more than 1,000 people who had come from throughout Breathitt County and from neighboring counties to witness justice executed on a man who had hidden systematic crime behind religious authority for 4 years. Wharton maintained his calm certainty to the end, speaking briefly before the trap was sprung to say that history would vindicate him, that future generations would understand that he had been a prophet rejected by his own time, that God's judgment would fall on those who had prevented him from completing the sacred work he had been commanded to perform. The scaffold functioned properly, the fall breaking Wharton's neck instantly and sparing him the prolonged strangulation that sometimes occurred when hangings were badly executed. His body was buried in an unmarked grave outside the Jackson Cemetery. Denied the Christian burial he had claimed the right to conduct for others, his name deliberately left off any marker so that his grave would be forgotten, and his memory would survive only as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked religious authority. The 17 women rescued from Wharton's underground chambers faced uncertain futures that the legal system and social services of 1880s Kentucky were ill-equipped to address. Some returned to families who welcomed them with varying degrees of understanding about the trauma they had experienced. These reunions were often complicated by years of separation, by the women's psychological damage that made normal family interaction difficult, by shame that families felt about having sent daughters into a situation that had resulted in captivity and abuse even though no one could have predicted Wharton's true nature. Other women found their families unwilling or unable to accept them back. Some families had moved away during the years of their daughters' captivity. Others had died or had fallen into such poverty that caring for a traumatized returning daughter was beyond their capacity. A few families explicitly rejected their daughters, either from shame about the abuse they had endured or from religious beliefs that held the women somehow responsible for what had happened, despite the clear evidence that they had been victims of crimes rather than participants in sin. Several women chose not to return to their families at all, instead settling in other counties where their pasts would be unknown and where they could attempt to build lives without the constant reminders of their captivity that would have been unavoidable in communities where everyone knew their stories. These women faced particular hardships, single women without family connections in a society that viewed such situations with suspicion, survivors of trauma who needed support but who had deliberately severed themselves from the only support networks available to them. Judge Renfro attempted to track the fates of all 17 survivors, documenting their circumstances in reports that continued for years after the trial. His records show that of the 17 women rescued from the underground chambers, 6 died within 5 years. Dr. Hackworth attributed these deaths to complications from their years of captivity, to bodies weakened by malnutrition and harsh conditions and repeated pregnancies, to immune systems compromised by living in damp underground environments where illness was common and medical care was primitive. The remaining 11 women survived longer, some into their 40s or 50s, but few achieved anything approaching normal life. Most never married. Most lived in poverty, dependent on charity or on family members who felt obligated to care for them. Most struggled with psychological problems that 1880s medicine had no way to treat effectively, experiencing what later generations would recognize as post-traumatic stress, but what contemporary physicians could only describe vaguely as nervous disorders or melancholia. The 9 children born in Wharton's underground chambers faced even grimmer prospects. 5 died before reaching age 10, victims of the health problems that had begun during their underground development, and that their bodies could not overcome despite being brought to the surface and given proper food and sunlight. The 4 who survived to adulthood all lived with severe developmental problems that prevented them from achieving independence. Not one married or had children of their own. Not one was able to hold employment beyond the most basic tasks. All required lifelong care that fell to various charitable institutions or to relatives who accepted responsibility for these damaged survivors because no one else would. The sanctuary property was abandoned immediately after the raid. The meeting house stood empty through the autumn of 1887, a silent witness to crimes that had occurred beneath its floor. In December, persons unknown, almost certainly local residents acting collectively, burned all structures on the property. The meeting house, the cabins, the shed that had concealed the entrance to the underground chambers, all were reduced to ash in a fire that burned for 2 days. The community never spoke publicly about who had started the blaze, but there was collective understanding that the burning was necessary, that the physical structures where such horrors had occurred needed to be erased from the landscape, even if the memory of what had happened there could never be fully forgotten. After the fire, local men filled the entrance to the underground chambers with rubble, sealing the passages where women had been imprisoned and where bodies had been buried. The work took several days, using stones and earth to fill the stairway and the passage beyond until no trace remained of the entrance, except a slight depression in the hillside that would gradually disappear as vegetation reclaimed the clearing where Wharton's settlement had stood. The lost ground hollow was left to return to wilderness, and within a generation the location of the sanctuary had become uncertain even to locals who had known the area before Wharton arrived. Rachel Compton, whose escape and testimony had exposed Wharton's crimes, recovered slowly from the infections and malnutrition that had nearly killed her. She spent 3 months in Dr. Hackworth's care in Jackson, during which time she provided extensive additional testimony that helped convict Wharton and his accomplices. She attended the execution in November, watching from the crowd as the man who had imprisoned her for 2 years died on the scaffold, and later told a reporter that she felt not satisfaction but only emptiness, a sense that justice executed could not undo what had been done or restore what had been taken from her and from the other survivors. Rachel never married and never had other children beyond the son and daughter who had been born to her in captivity. She lived quietly in a small house outside Jackson, supported initially by contributions from churches and later by a small pension that the Kentucky legislature granted her in 1895 in recognition of the courage she had shown in escaping and testifying. She avoided public attention, refusing most interview requests, living as much as possible as though her years in Wharton's chambers had never occurred, even though she understood that those years had defined her life in ways that could never be overcome. In 1938, 5 years before her death, Rachel gave one final interview to a Louisville newspaper reporter who was researching the Wharton case for an article about frontier justice. She was 70 years old by then, her health failing, but her memory still clear about events that had occurred 51 years earlier. She told the reporter that her survival had been driven by determination to testify, that she had crawled through wilderness for 3 days specifically to ensure someone learned the truth about what was happening beneath Wharton's sanctuary, that exposing his crimes and saving the other women had been the purpose that kept her alive when dying would have been easier. She said that her life afterward had been difficult, marked by nightmares and by inability to form normal relationships and by a pervasive sadness that she had learned to live with but that had never left her. But she also said that she had no regrets about escaping or about testifying, that seeing Wharton hang and seeing the other women freed had given her life meaning, even if that meaning came at tremendous personal cost. She died in 1943 at age 73, buried in the Jackson Cemetery with a simple marker that gave her name and dates with no mention of the events that had defined her existence. Judge Marcus Renfro's documentation of the Wharton case influenced Kentucky law enforcement procedures for decades, establishing precedents for investigating isolated religious communities when concerns arose about the welfare of members who had lost contact with the outside world. The case was cited in legal arguments throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries as courts grappled with balancing religious freedom against the state's duty to protect citizens from abuse that claimed divine justification. The principle that religious authority did not exempt individuals from accountability for crimes against those in their care became firmly established in Kentucky law, partly through the precedent set by Wharton's prosecution. The physical evidence of Wharton's sanctuary gradually disappeared as the forest reclaimed the clearing where his settlement had stood. By the 1930s, nothing remained visible above ground except slight depressions and irregularities in the terrain that might have been building foundations, but that were equally explainable as natural features. The sealed entrance to the underground chambers remained hidden beneath decades of accumulated soil and vegetation. Even locals who had known the exact location in 1887 could not reliably identify it 50 years later after trails had changed and landmarks had shifted. The story itself survived in local folklore, told and retold in versions that sometimes embellished or simplified the actual events, but that preserved the essential truth that a preacher had imprisoned women beneath a religious settlement and that his crimes had been exposed through one woman's courage in escaping and testifying despite knowing that her testimony would expose her to public scrutiny and would force her to relive trauma she would rather have forgotten. The story served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of isolation, about how communities that were too respectful of privacy and too deferential to religious authority could enable systematic abuse that flourished unseen until some combination of courage and chance brought it to light. Modern historians who have researched the Wharton case have confirmed the essential accuracy of contemporary accounts, though many details remain uncertain because documentation from frontier Kentucky was often incomplete, and because participants had reasons to minimize or obscure certain aspects of what occurred. The underground chambers have never been excavated archaeologically, partly because their exact location is uncertain and partly because descendants of survivors have opposed disturbing the site. The story remains one of the darkest chapters in Kentucky history, a reminder that predators can hide behind any authority, including religious authority, and that vigilance and willingness to question authority are necessary safeguards against abuse, even in communities that value faith and tradition and respect for spiritual leaders. If you found this investigation compelling, subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss our documentation of forgotten histories. Leave a comment with your location and local time because we want to know where these dark truths reach across the world. Share this video with anyone interested in understanding how systematic abuse can flourish when authority operates without oversight, and how communities must balance respect for religion with responsibility to protect vulnerable members from exploitation masquerading as divine service.